With the basic concept of suzerain-vassal treaties in mind, we're in a position to see what insights they offer us as we explore the connections between covenants and kingdom. Now, we should say from the outset that in a broad sense, the term covenant or berit describes many different relationships. It points to relationships between friends, spouses, political leaders, tribes, and nations. All of these relationships were called covenants in the Old Testament because they formally bound people to each other with mutual obligations and expectations. But these relationships were so diverse that their covenants differed in many ways. And more than this, the Scriptures sometimes compare these diverse covenant relationships to God's relationship with His people. For instance, our relationship with God is described as marriage, as a family bond, and as friendship. So we can learn much about ourselves and God from these different types of covenants. But our concern in this lesson is not with this broad range of analogies, but with one specific type of covenant in the Old Testament, namely divine covenants. These are the covenants that God Himself made with people. God made 6 major corporate covenants in the Old Testament. He entered into covenants with Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Christ. In this lesson, we're primarily interested in understanding the character of these covenants and how they relate to the kingdom of God. Now, we will explore all 6 divine covenants in this lesson, but at this point, we'll look briefly at one of these covenants, the covenant with Moses, to illustrate how suzerain vassal treaties have helped us understand the character of Old Testament covenants. The covenant with Moses is particularly well suited for our purposes because God revealed so much more about this covenant than He did about any others in the Old Testament. When we look at the covenant God made with Moses, it quickly becomes apparent that it was structured in ways that resemble ancient Near Eastern suzerain vassal treaties. Moses' covenant consisted of the same 3 elements that we've seen in these treaties, and this resemblance helps us understand that in a fundamental sense, God's covenants were the way that He, as the great King of Israel, chose to administer His kingdom. It will be helpful for us to look at one passage in particular at this point that reveals this resemblance. In Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, God initiated His covenant through Moses with Israel in this way. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These verses open the scene where God entered into covenant with Israel when the nation gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai on their way to the Promised Land. And they closely reflect the 3 central elements of a suzerain vassal treaty. You'll recall that suzerain vassal treaties had 3 main concerns: the presentation of royal benevolence, the requirement of vassal loyalty, and the consequences of loyalty and disloyalty. And interestingly enough, these same 3 concerns appear in Moses' covenant as it was introduced in Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. First, God reminded Israel of His divine benevolence, demonstrated in the way He had graciously delivered them from slavery in Egypt. As He said in Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Like ancient Near Eastern emperors, God reminded the Israelites that He had been their kind king. He had done great things in delivering Israel from Egypt, and it was in the context of His benevolence toward His people that He offered to enter into covenant with them. Second, God called for human loyalty. Listen again to Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. "Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." Like ancient Near Eastern suzerains, God required loyalty from his human vassals. Although Moses' covenant was based on God's mercy and not human good works, God still required his servants to be loyal, and Moses' law spelled out many of the ways they were to show their loyalty. The people were expected to obey the regulations of the covenant. Third, Moses' covenant also entailed consequences for loyalty and disloyalty from God's people. This element becomes clear in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Like ancient Near Eastern emperors, God made it clear that if the people were faithful, they would receive great blessings. They would be a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests. And by implication, if they were unfaithful, they would not receive these great blessings, but would be cursed instead. So we see that the threefold pattern of suzerain-vassal treaties appears in God's covenant with Moses. As suzerains claimed to be kind to their vassals, when God entered covenant with Israel, he first established his divine benevolence toward them. The covenant went on to set forth the expectations of human loyalty to God, and the covenant specified the consequences of blessing and curses that the people could expect if they were loyal or disloyal to God. The fact that the Mosaic covenant reflected these elements of suzerain-vassal treaties demonstrates that at a very basic level, when God made covenant with his people, he revealed himself to Israel as their great king, their emperor, and that he wanted his people to think of themselves as his vassals. Old Testament divine covenants were essentially royal arrangements. Kingdom and covenants go hand in hand because covenants were the means by which God ruled over his kingdom. They were God's kingdom administrations, leading the kingdom of God toward its destiny of expanding to the ends of the earth.